So the reason we got involved is we had started our business and human rights work around the same time that the voluntary principles uh, were about a couple of years before they actually started. And we had been doing a lot of work around the extractive industries and security in places like Nigeria and in India, as well as in Colombia. And we had documented multiple companies that had had security issues on the ground. And it was my feeling in particular that when you start seeing this many companies having the same problem simultaneously, that you've got an issue within the industry about how security is handled. And it was really uh, that finding in our research that really led me and us to start engaging with companies and particularly their security departments and others, and eventually the U.S. government to try to address this by creating a set of standards that would address human rights and security. And actually, we had started with several companies a couple of years before at the World Bank, at the IFC, who had started to develop guidance on this. We had started to develop guidance with them on it. But then, as our research got more in depth and as we spoke to more companies and the governments, it became clear there was a need for a clear set of standards because back in 1998 or 99, there was no common understanding among human rights groups or companies or governments about the responsibilities of companies. I mean, this is still 12, 13 years before the UN GPs and things of that nature. So there was no universally accepted set of norms for companies in these or many other situations. I think today, basically, you would look at every major multinational oil, mining, and other companies too, even in agribusiness and the like, who would accept the voluntary principles as the basic set of norms governing security. And if I look back 20 years ago when I started working on this, that wasn't the case then. It is certainly the case now. So, as a normative effort in terms of informing the industry and institutions like the World Bank and some governments, it has been quite important in defining both what companies should do in these situations, but also promoting certain concepts very early on that are now completely integrated into how we think about the human rights responsibilities of business. And the one that's most important is the risk assessment part of it, right? So the concept of doing risk assessment was the basic idea was that if you can identify the problems you have ahead of time and mitigate them, then you can avoid the human rights problems altogether. And that concept, I think, was first kind of introduced as a standard within the voluntary principles. So I think the voluntary principles have had some very important impact as a set of norms. I think there have been challenges in terms of how you get all the companies in particular to implement them and how you get governments to recognize them and follow them in relation to their public forces like the police and military. And that's been a real challenge with voluntary principles. But I also thought that by 2020 or maybe even 2010, that a lot of the elements of the voluntary principles would be part of the law and in different countries. And that hasn't happened yet. So I think one of the challenges for the voluntary principles today is it's clear that a lot of the concepts are universally recognized by the industry and many companies implement them, but we're still missing that piece where they become a firm rule, not simply for the companies that are members of the voluntary principles, but for all of the companies in the sector, including those that don't want to follow any rules, right? So the real next step or evolution of the voluntary principles is finding ways to make sure everybody follows them, and that includes other companies, other governments, and the like. One of the things that I've learned over the last 20 years is that the voluntary principles did introduce a lot of key concepts that would shape the way we think about business and human rights or corporate responsibility generally, most notably risk assessment, but also developing norms through a multi-stakeholder process. And the value of that is that whether you're a company or whether you're a human rights group or whether you're a government, even if you're not fully satisfied with what the norms say, you have to accept that all parties have agreed to them. And that's an important concept when you start thinking about what law might look like. I mean, it's easier to get a law based on something everybody already agrees on than something entirely new or made by a group of people that aren't really engaged in this. So I think in that respect, it's been quite important. I also think it's been important in particularly for the companies that have really diligently implemented them. I would like to think it has changed the way they both address human rights, but also changed the problems on the ground, right? So that there are fewer among those that implement them than we've seen otherwise. And I think the next step has got to be making these kinds of norms more permanent and not just relying on the voluntary principles process as the sole process for which people follow human rights when it comes to dealing with security. I mean, if we look around the world right now, there is clearly a movement towards making human rights due diligence the law, right? And we've seen elements of this in different ways. We've seen it in the anti-slavery laws in say, California or the UK. We've seen it in Dodd-Frank with the conflict minerals rules, where disclosure about what you're doing is part of the law. But now we're seeing with the French duty of vigilance law, with the discussions around the EU due diligence mandate, with what Germany's doing, clearly governments now are moving into the area of making that permanent. And that's certainly, if those proposals become law, then that certainly implicates the voluntary principles in the sense that there is due diligence requirements in them. But more broadly, I think if industry accepts that these are norms and human rights groups accept these are norms and governments do, the it shouldn't be that hard to make that part of the law too. In some ways, the IFC at the World Bank, they do apply these norms in their lending, and we've seen that in the past to a certain degree. So I think the next step for the voluntary principles is how do you enshrine them into law or into regulations in a more permanent way? Because at this point, 20 years on, I don't think you would find any mining company or oil company or a human rights watch who says there's something wrong with them as norms. We've all agreed for the last 20 years they are the norm. So now it's a question of making them kind of permanent and more institutionalized, both in the operations of companies, but also how governments approach these issues as well.